Okay, so we're diving into Nexus today. You all know Harari's book. Our listeners sent in a ton of excerpts and articles. Looks like we're tackling the whole history of information, how humans have always wrestled with truth and order
Mhm.
and all the unexpected outcomes of the things we create.
And Nexus is such a fitting title when you think about it, because Harari isn't just giving us a history lesson here. He's drawing these kind of unsettling lines between ancient myths and the algorithms we're building today. He's saying both can kind of spiral out of control in ways their creators, never saw coming.
Right. Like he starts by talking about how incredibly far humanity's come in the past, what is it, 100,000 years? But then it's like, whoa, record scratch. He slams on the brakes and brings up ecological collapse, AI potentially going rogue. He even uses religion as this early example of an idea that was so powerful that all these unintended consequences that echoed through history.
And it's crazy how much that resonates with all the anxieties people have today. You ever catch yourself having those late night conversations, wondering if we're developing technology faster than we can actually handle it responsibly? Climate change, AI ethics, these aren't just, abstract problems anymore. They come from this exact tension Harari's talking about.
Totally. And it's not even just about having more information, right? This is where his whole take on truth gets really interesting. You know that saying, information wants to be free?
Yeah.
Harari's saying it's less about representing reality perfectly. It's more about those connections information makes.
Yeah.
Almost like plugging into a network of shared uh, emotions and beliefs.
Yeah, it's a huge shift in perspective. He uses music to kind of illustrate it. Imagine listening to a really powerful symphony. It doesn't literally describe the world, right? But it can evoke these shared emotions. It creates a sense of connection between total strangers. Harari argues that power to connect, to kind of build these bridges of feeling, that's at the core of how information shapes our realities.
And sometimes those connections can be incredibly literal. Like that story about Sherami, the pigeon, saved an American battalion in World War I.
Well, that's a perfect example. Just one message, carried by a pigeon, of all things. Corrected these artillery coordinates. They were accidentally targeting their own troops, literally changed reality for those soldiers.
Talk about high stakes, right?
Yeah.
It shows how even a simple piece of information, just by connecting 2 points, can have a life or death impact.
Yeah.
But it makes you think, if truth is more about these connections, these narratives we share, than about some objective facts, how do we even navigate a world that's drowning in information designed to, influence us?
That's the million-dollar question. And it's not carrier pigeons anymore. This ties into the rise of all this emotionally charged content online, the power of storytelling, even in reporting that's supposed to be objective. We're bombarded with information that's engineered to shape how we feel and ultimately our understanding of what's true.
It's like we're all wired into this massive, invisible web of stories. And speaking of stories, Harari takes us on this journey through different types of information networks, starting with, get this, myths. You might think myths are just these primitive tales, but Harari sees them as something way more powerful.
Absolutely. He says myths were incredibly effective at bringing people together, uniting them around shared beliefs and values. Think of them like the original social networks, right? Creating a sense of belonging, shared identity. And he gives this really powerful example. It's about the Jewish tradition of Passover.
Where families gather every year and reenact the Exodus from Egypt.
Exactly. It's not just a history lesson. It's this shared experience that's passed down through generations, reinforces their collective identity, proof that myths have this lasting power, even if they're not, historically accurate in every detail.
Okay, so from myths, we jump to bureaucracy. Not exactly a page-turner, right? But essential nonetheless. Harari gets that people tend to distrust bureaucracy. It's all, lists, rules, not exactly the stuff of great storytelling. But he makes this point that bureaucratic systems are like the invisible scaffolding holding our complex societies together, underpinning everything from taxes to our legal systems.
And what's really interesting here is how the shift to written records, which is basically the backbone of bureaucracy, actually flipped the whole power dynamic of societies. He uses the example of ancient land ownership. Imagine a king trying to keep tabs on every single plot of land in his kingdom. Impossible, right? So local communities had a lot of control.
Because the king had to rely on their knowledge of who owned what.
Right. But then written records changed the game. They shifted power towards those central authorities, allowed them to manage these larger, more complex territories.
That's such a good point. It paved the way for these massive societies we live in today, but it also created a whole new set of challenges, new ways of managing information, keeping order, And that leads us right into all the different political systems and how they handle information.
Yeah. And this is where Harari draws this stark contrast between democracy and totalitarianism. He's basically framing them as these fundamentally different approaches to like controlling the flow of information.
Yeah.
He describes democracies as like these bustling marketplaces of information, messy, vibrant, tons of different channels, constant debate, opinions flying everywhere. It can feel chaotic, but it's also like incredibly resilient.
Yeah, it's almost like a jungle ecosystem, isn't it? You've got all these different species interacting, competing, but in the end, they all contribute to this like thriving whole.
Exactly. And he talks about the rise of newspapers in those early democracies. Like, think about the United States. It was huge. Suddenly, people could share ideas across these massive distances, contributed to this like shared national conversation.
Right.
It makes you realize how much we take it for granted today. We just pick up our phones, scroll through the news, but just like a printed page back then, being able to share ideas over huge distances, that was revolutionary.
Oh, totally. Imagine feeling connected to people you'd never even met,
Yeah.
all united by like reading about the same needs. It literally helped build a nation.
And then on the other hand, you've got totalitarian regimes. Harari paints them as like the total opposite. These are systems obsessed with control, with maintaining this single, unchallenged narrative,
Right.
They're all about suppressing dissent, silencing anyone who disagrees with the official story.
And he uses those chilling examples from Stalin's Soviet Union, right? Like the dekolonization campaign.
Yeah, chilling is the right word for it. They basically invented this whole category of enemy peasant, using totally made up data, then use that information to justify like mass deportations and executions.
Yeah.
It shows how these totalitarian regimes, they weaponize information, twist it to fit their narrative, even if it means sacrificing the truth and innocent lives.
It's a scary reminder of what happens when information is controlled by the people in power. And it kind of makes you wonder, with the rise of computers, the internet, everything, are we more vulnerable to these kinds of manipulations now? Or are we moving towards something more democratic, a more, decentralized information landscape?
That's the question, isn't it? And Harari doesn't shy away from how complicated it is. I mean, on the one hand, the internet could be this amazing tool for making information more democratic, connecting people across borders, giving a voice to those who've been marginalized. On the other hand, as Harari points out, it's also fertile ground for misinformation, echo chambers, algorithmic manipulation, all of that.
Yeah.
And maybe the most unsettling thing about this whole digital world is how computers are becoming these independent agents, in the information network. It's not just that we use them as tools anymore. They're learning, adapting, and in some cases, even making decisions on their own.
That's where it gets a little Black Mirror-ish, don't you think? It's not just computers storing information. It's about them shaping the whole information landscape.
Exactly. And Harari highlights how dangerous that shift could be. Take algorithms, for example. We design them to optimize for things like engagement on social media, right?
Yeah.
But what happens when those algorithms, in their quest for, clicks and likes, end up amplifying outrage and misinformation?
Like in that example with the Rohingya massacre.
Yeah.
That's something Harari talks about in the book. Facebook's algorithms actually played a part in spreading that hate speech that fueled the violence against them.
It's a perfect example of how, even with good intentions, we don't always fully get what these complex systems are doing. And it can have these really terrible consequences in the real world. And it's not like AI is evil or anything, like sentient, in some sci-fi way.
Right.
It's about misaligned goals. It's about unintended consequences. We design these systems to optimize for one specific thing, and we overlook the bigger picture.
Yeah. It's almost like we're stuck in this constant state of like technological whiplash.
Yeah.
We create these tools to make our lives easier to connect with each other. And then those same tools end up having these ripple effects that we're just starting to understand.
And those ripple effects, they extend to our sense of privacy, too, our individual freedoms. Harari talks about how we're moving beyond those traditional forms of surveillance, like, cameras,
Right.
into this realm of data collection that feels like something out of like a dystopian novel.
He talks about stuff like eye tracking technology, doesn't he? The idea that our emotions, even our thoughts, could be analyzed just by how our eyes move.
Exactly. And he brings up a real-world example. The Iranian government is using facial recognition technology to, get this, police what women are wearing. It
Wow.
really makes you realize these technologies aren't just, theoretical possibilities anymore. They're being used right now, and often in ways that raise serious ethical questions.
Pretty chilling when you think about it. And it makes you wonder, where do we draw the line? Like,
Yeah.
what are we willing to give up? Security versus freedom in this digital age? That's a tough one.
It's a debate we can't afford to ignore.
Hmm.
And it goes beyond just governments and big corporations.
Mhm.
Every time we click accept on those cookie policies, every time we share our location data, we're part of this huge experiment, data collection, algorithmic influence, it's all connected.
Right.
And the stakes are incredibly high. It's not just about our privacy, it's about the very fabric of our social and political realities.
Yeah, good point.
And that leads us to what Harari sees as one of the biggest dangers of this new information age. The potential for these digital cocoons and algorithmic bias to basically fracture our shared sense of reality.
So it's like we're headed toward this future where everything we see online is like personalized just for us, right?
Yeah.
Curated by these algorithms that think they know what we want, what we'll click on. It's like we're all going to be living in these custom-made information bubbles.
Exactly. Harari calls them digital cocoons. It's like the echo chamber effect, but cranked up to 11. Imagine a world where everything, your news feeds, your social media, even just your search results, it's all filtered to reinforce what you already believe. All your biases, but you might not even realize it's happening. You're constantly seeing stuff that confirms what you already think, which makes it way harder to engage with other perspectives, to ever challenge your own assumptions.
And it's not even just about like having different opinions, right? It's
Yeah.
about losing that shared reality, that common ground that we need to like actually function as a society.
Yeah.
If everyone's living in their own little information universe, how do we even have real conversations, let alone solve these big complex problems together?
It's a recipe for disaster, basically. Total polarization, social fragmentation, the works. And it's especially worrying because those divisions, they get amplified by algorithmic bias, which we touched on earlier. These algorithms, they seem super sophisticated, but at the end of the day, they're just trained on data. And that data, it's full of our own deeply ingrained societal biases.
So we're basically teaching AI to be prejudiced, even if we don't mean to.
Pretty much. It's like we're handing a magnifying glass to our own worst impulses, and the effects can be huge. Like, it can reinforce discrimination in everything. Hiring, housing, even just perpetuating harmful stereotypes that drive us further apart.
It's a pretty bleak picture, honestly. Feels like we're caught in this web of our own making.
Yeah.
And it's tough to see a way out. So, like, what do we do? Does Harari offer any solutions? Any hope at all?
He doesn't claim to have all the answers, but he definitely gives us a powerful call to action. He says we have to become way more aware of how this is working, how information is shaping our lives, our societies, even just how we understand reality itself. It's about recognizing the power of the stories we tell ourselves, the stories we're told, and asking ourselves, where did those stories come from in the first place? Whose interests are they really serving?
It's like that saying, right? The fish is the last to discover water. We're so surrounded by this stuff, it's hard to even see the information environment we're swimming in.
Exactly. We have to become more critical, more careful about what sources we trust, what narratives we buy into, and we have to be thoughtful about the data we're feeding these algorithms. We have to challenge bias wherever we see it. It's about demanding more transparency and accountability from the tech companies that hold so much power in this new information landscape.
Sounds like a tall order. Where do we even start?
It starts small. Next time you're scrolling through your news feeds, stop for a sec. Ask yourself, why am I seeing this? Who's benefiting from me looking at this? When you're researching online, look for different points of view, even and especially the ones that challenge what you already think. Support organizations fighting misinformation.
It's like becoming more conscious of our information diets, right?
Mm.
The same way people are getting more mindful of the food they eat, how it impacts their health. We've got to apply that same lens to the information we're taking in.
Absolutely. And that's really the heart of Harari's message. We have the power. We might not build the algorithms, but we're the users. We can shape the information landscape. It's about realizing we're not just passively consuming information, we're actively shaping the future of truth itself.
Now, that's a powerful thought. The future isn't some fixed thing that just happens to us. It's something we're all creating every single day. One click, one share, one conscious choice at a time.
Well said. And maybe if we can embrace that responsibility, become more thoughtful, more discerning about how we navigate this crazy information landscape, maybe then we can steer ourselves toward a future where truth actually wins out, where it's not just about the loudest voices or the most convenient narratives. A future where technology helps us understand each other better, connect with each other better, and create a more informed, more connected, and yeah, hopefully a more humane world.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And on that note, we're going to go ahead and wrap up this deep dive. Big thanks to our listeners for sending in such thought-provoking questions. And until next time, keep those information filters sharp, everyone.